afternoon, hello to everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode of Edu Focus, storytelling to uncover integrity violation in education. My name is Raffaella from the Network of Education Policy Centers, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mihailo Milovanovic from Center for Applied Policy and Integrity from Bulgaria. Welcome, Mihailo, and thank you for joining us today. And Olja Jovanovic from the University of Belgrade. Network of Education Policy Centers and Center for Applied Policy and Integrity recently implemented the project Integrity in Education supported by Open Society Foundations. The project conducted local-led integrity assessment in the Republic of Moldova, Mongolia, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan to investigate the integrity risks in two education areas, teachers' recruitment and parental informal payment to education. The project involved 4 network members: the Educational Center Pro Didactica from the Republic of Moldova, the Mongolian Education Alliance from Mongolia, the International Institute for Education Policy Planning and Management from Georgia, and the Foundation Education Initiative Support from Kyrgyzstan. This was a very intense learning process for all of us, and we somehow, and it helped us to understand how to address the integrity issues in education within the system, empowering education practitioners and participants, and linking the integrity risks to policy gaps in education that open the possibility, that may open the possibility for unethical behavior. National reports of the project and synthesis reports authored by Olja and Mihailo is available in the publication section of our webpage edupolicy.net. The assessment is based on in-test methodology and evidence collection tools was developed by CAPI within the framework of the OECD anti-corruption framework for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Mihailo and Olja. Let's start from the beginning of this story. Let's start from the methodology. So the qualitative data collection of the report involved the focus group and dynamic storytelling. Can you, maybe I can start with Olja. Can you, Olja, briefly describe what the dynamic storytelling technique in research is and in which research fields is more appropriate?
Thank you, Raffaella, for this question. So first, we have chosen to use qualitative approach since we wanted, on the one hand, to explore more further perspectives of different stakeholders about integrity in educational context. And the second goal was to somehow raise awareness on the importance of integrity within educational context. However, since integrity is a rather sensitive topic, we have decided to use dynamic storytelling as an approach to this data collection. And this kind of approach relies on human urge to tell stories. And all the time we tell some kind of stories to other person. Through these stories, we share our experiences, we share our values, we share our worldviews. And at the same time, through these different stories, we give some kind of meaning to the events in which we have participated. And this was the really starting point for dynamic storytelling. Besides telling the story, as you heard in the label of the approach, we have also the term dynamic, which really refers to the notion that this telling the stories or building the story is really some kind of interactive process. And it can be interactive in different ways. One way to become interactive is, for example, to write a story to someone, to have some kind of idea or expected audience to which you are telling some kind of story. And through building this kind of story, you are really interacting with this imagined person to whom you are telling the story. The second way you can interact is to organize these kinds of activities as some kind of collective process in which, in order to tell the story, you need to negotiate different meanings, you have to negotiate different endings with different with different participants in this process. And also another way to have this kind of interaction is to write some kind of story and to rewrite it after certain events. And all these three different types of approach to dynamic storytelling were applied in this integrity project. We had techniques such as writing a letter to a peer, or writing a story about integrity violation and rewriting it after certain events. Or, for example, we had some kind of activities which are collective description or evolving of a story about certain integrity violations within educational context. Why is this, or when is this dynamic storytelling really appropriate? I think one important feature of dynamic storytelling is that it is really inductive process. So as we all know, integrity in educational context is really context-specific phenomena. So that is why it is really important to have possibility to hear the stories of different participants and to try to build this common story from all their experiences. So in this sense, through writing these different stories, what we have is that the one who is telling the story is really building in his or her individual histories with education, and at the same time he or she is building in also some kind of collective history and this institutional framework in which these stories emerge. Another important feature of dynamic storytelling is that it is really good when you want to use it for some kind of sensitive topics such as integrity in education. Why? Because you are not really talking, or you are not really exploring how a certain event happened, who was involved, what were the motivations, what were the consequences, but you are offering a possibility for participants to tell the story about some kind of common knowledge, about some kind of common experiences. You are not really interested in the specific event, but you are more interested in some kind of general patterns in this context. And the third point, which is extremely important when we speak about dynamic storytelling, is that you're really exploring possible and probable events. So you're not really interested in what happened or what are the facts, but you're interested in how things could happen in a certain context. And this is really important when we speak especially about policy implementation, because, for example, you can explore how certain policies are understood by different participants and how they could be implemented within the practice. Not sure if I answered the question, but yeah.
You did it, and you did it very, very detailed at many levels, I would say. Thank you very much. I was one of the witnesses of this activity, and I have to say that it's quite. It's very powerful for the representatives. It does require a very experienced facilitator, but it's very powerful sharing for all the participants. Let's now go back to the aim of our project. So very often when we have vulnerable areas in education, no matter if they are connected to integrity risks or not, vulnerable areas have most negative effect on our most vulnerable groups in education. So how the integrity risks or this unethical behavior affect inclusion and quality access to education? Maybe I can pick the answers from both of you. Mikhailo, would you like to start, and then we come back to Olya so she can wrestle a bit?
Yes, I mean the experience we had from the two countries we worked with, but also from countries we covered before. There are direct ways and indirect ways. The direct ways is, of course, when you see that certain people are being disadvantaged in ways that underline their impossibility to participate and do or engage in these informal practices that would allow them to get what they actually need from education. For example, if we're talking about situations like we uncovered in countries like Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, where under the pretext of requesting additional teaching support, additional classes, and so on. Parents are expected to pay, and this is very often the only way to ensure that your child gets to the school. So these are very classical things, but if you think about it in a more broader way, beyond the violation itself, it becomes clear that, yeah, it's kind of the old story. If you cannot afford to pay, or if you don't want to pay, you probably will not get the service, which, well, the legislation of the country, its international and national commitments, they all promise that you actually should be getting this, but you're not, because you are not really able or not willing to participate. So if I may say so, you have this kind of two groups of people who are being disproportionately affected by integrity violations usually. And this is a group of the people who can't afford financially to participate in that, or who don't have the right connections, which is another form of capital, maybe not financial, but a form of social capital. And then also is the group of people who are actually fair, who are also disproportionately affected, because even though you might have the resources, you might have the connections, maybe you don't want to participate in that because this runs counter your convictions. And so this group of people who are disadvantaged and the group of people who are fair and opt for integrity, usually they're the ones who lose out by these integrity violations. And interestingly enough, most of the research focuses on this first group of people who are actually in a disadvantaged position. But I think that there is a lot of potential also in digging deeper and seeing who are these people who resist the temptation and who, despite all the adverse circumstances, opt to act with integrity. Are there people like this? Every now and then we meet them, and I think they're really an interesting case study in itself. How do you manage to do the right thing, although everybody else does exactly the opposite? And so, yeah, these two groups, disadvantaged people, financially and socially disadvantaged groups, and also those who, for whatever reason, decide it's better to act with integrity.
Yeah, thank you, Mikhail. Olya would like to elaborate on this question.
I will just maybe give some kind of different angle on this question. In all these countries in which integrity project took place, we have really long-term policy reforms, and all these reforms are really aiming at improving quality and equity of education. However, what we have seen and what the integrity lens somehow allows you to see is that what we have in all these areas is that people are using old habits for the new tasks. So nothing is really changing. You are introducing new policy aims, new policy activities, however, practice remains the same. And what is really going on here is that we are really investing lots of effort and lots of resources to create some kind of illusion of change and not really in changing. And this could be really problem because integrity violation in this sense serve as mechanism for status quo and keeping on with status quo. Why is this important and how is this really affecting inclusiveness of education? Well, I think it is rather clear. However, one important aspect is that through all these repeated experiences of unsuccessful reforms, we really start thinking about reforms as something which is unattainable, as something which is an illusion or ideal which cannot be really attained. And in this sense, we are really building some kind of learned helplessness, that we cannot really change anything. And in this sense, all these policy reforms, although they are trying through these integrity violations, they do not really succeed in changing inclusiveness of educational systems. So what we have is that, for example, children from the vulnerable groups are now, for example, enrolled in schools, but they are not really provided with the quality education. We have new forms of segregation, or not really new forms, but we have resurrection of old forms of segregation, such as special classes or homeschooling. So system is really adapting, so nothing is changing, so nothing will change. And I think this is rather pessimistic view, but I think it is really important to understand why are these things happening and how these inclusive integrity violations are appearing and what enables these kinds of behavior to manifest themselves within educational context.
Yeah, very interesting perspective. You have mentioned that in the countries where we conducted the research, we have this pattern of ongoing reforms. But can you also identify a pattern in the most common vulnerable areas? So can we, in the countries where you did the research, not only in these four, but you did also in some other countries, can we talk about most common vulnerable areas, or they are very country specific? Mikhail.
It's always the nicest part because you can talk about big things and big words without really going much into the detail. But in fact, if I would kind of go back and think about all the details that we have recorded over the years in different countries, despite the really large diversity of cases, situations, and so on, there are certain commonalities indeed. One of them is that, if you're trying to understand why do people do what they do, and at some point you realize that much of this has to do with ample degree of distrust that the education system, the way it is set up, the way it operates at the moment, it cannot really deliver what people expect. And so in some ways, if one would look where this distrust comes from specifically, there are at least three areas. One is, of course, the area of quality assurance. So the case where there is little in terms of reliable mechanisms to really make statements about what students do and what they don't do. So this is an area where if there's not enough trust, if the quality assurance doesn't work well, if basic things like grading the students is not trustworthy, it really opens a lot of possibilities for abuse. And sometimes even you have to abuse the system. Otherwise, if everybody else has good grades and your kid is the only one that doesn't, you kind of, as a parent, you start considering this your fault. So quality assurance in general, especially when it comes to the learning outcomes of students, is one such area. Another is, again, talking about distrust, the area of staff, where in many cases when we discuss favoritism, one big area that we covered also in our research with you, as you know, and then you wonder why do actually people prefer to hire their people they know, their relatives and so on. Is this necessarily bad, to ask it in a more provocative way? And of course, hiring your relative doesn't mean that the relative is a bad teacher. And in many cases, it seems that there is lack of trust in the system of qualifications. There's lack of trust in the credentials of candidates for teaching jobs. And what happens is that, in fact, if you're a principal, the only thing you can do is to rely on people you actually know, on recommendations by fellow principals, which might not be exactly in line with the candidates that the system delivers to you. And so you resort to favoritism because in this case, you know that, well, taking this person, I'm going to get the right person for the job, although this might not be the person that comes up first in the list of candidates for that job. So this kind of a distrust in whether teachers are really good, whether candidates for teaching profession are really good, is another reason why there's distrust, and it's another big area. Everything related to staff accreditation, staff credentials, to professional development and so on, and to the proof the teachers and candidates for teaching provide that they're qualified. So this is another area of weakness. And the third area of major weakness is, of course, the area where we discuss about resources, financial resources. And here I just want to clarify, it's not only about the amount of money available, it's very often more about the way this money is being allocated and where, and about the perceptions of people in the education system of whether this money is enough. Sometimes if you look at the aggregate numbers, money seems to be enough. There's a lot of money flowing into education, but somehow it doesn't really reach its destination, is one scenario. Or even if it reaches destination, people who are in the school, people who are responsible for managing the providers, they feel that this is not enough. And so this is another area of weakness which really drives a lot of the violations as we know it. And in some cases you even say, well, perhaps it's understandable, And so, yeah, these are the three major areas: quality assurance regarding students, quality assurance regarding staff, if you wish, staff credentials, and resources, financial resources.
Yeah, I mean, listening to you each time we discuss this topic, it really seems to me that it's so many important to take in consideration all the perspectives that happen in the unethical behavior. Even though we have also to take to stress that corruption and integrity violation are an absolute damage for our education system, but it's good to prevent them, to understand what's really happening in education systems. So if we have some area that are common in our research, and considering that we have many countries that are now involved very actively in creating ethical code of conduct in education to contribute to integrity culture in education, do you see that there are some universal recommendations that can be shared? We can start with Olia this time.
Well, as Mihailo said about, for example, this example when everyone has high grades, why my children shouldn't have high grades and what I need to do for my children to have high grades. I think it is really important to understand that people in educational system have certain expectations from the system and from the other educational stakeholders. At the same time, it is not enough to have expectations from the system which are not met. So integrity violation happens. What is needed also that there is another person who has some kind of complementary motivation to yours. For example, if you want to have a higher grades for your children, there should be some kind of teacher who is willing to give this kind of higher grades for some compensation, for example. And at the same time, third aspect is that it is needed that there is a system who enables these kinds of behaviors to happen. And I think it is really important for all educational systems to explore more further what are expectations of different educational stakeholders regarding education, and at the same time, what are these hidden incentives within the educational system that somehow enforce these kinds of behaviors or allow these behaviors to emerge. And also another thing I would like to mention is it seems like in all these countries in which we have been working so far, we have these policy reforms and they are usually followed by high demands on the one hand, high level of the control, and low support to implementation of these reforms. And this kind of disbalance is really creating incentives for integrity violations and really supports people to work around these reforms. So I would say that that is also one point which we should have in mind when we think about policy reforms and changes we want to implement.
Thank you. Thank you, Olia. Mihailo would like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the different ways to comment on that. I mean, having codes of conduct on a purely technical level, like as an instrument, something that has certain advantages. One of the advantages is always the first line of defense, and one of the things that is most commonly being done in response to revelations that there are corruption problems in the system. It's also something that international organizations, who are usually an important player and driver of changes in this area, prefer to go for first, because developing a code of conduct is actually a positive response to an otherwise very negative problem. And so on purely technical level, one of the challenges with the codes of conduct is that very often they do not really divide responsibilities clearly of who is supposed to do what. And even if they do, there is really lack of description of what exactly are the consequences in case of non-compliance. And this brings us also to the other problem with this instrument, that sometimes it's not clear on what level of responsibility does enforcement and monitoring of compliance lie, and so on and so on. So we all agree having code of conduct is not a bad thing. Teachers have this kind of aspirational description of what they should do or should not do. This could also include the principals and whoever else, but very often it's not clear. So what if this is not? Do we have a legal basis to describe some kind of sanctions or consequences in case this code is breached? And if yes, is it a provider level of responsibility, central level, regional level? So these questions are very often not properly addressed. So this is on the purely technical level. Even if we have solved all these things, I think that a proper package of actions would have to go deeper, because if people in the system have a reason to do things, we must kind of identify what these reasons are. And this whole approach, INTES, and also what Ollie was saying about dynamic storytelling, you're trying to go beyond what we see at first glance and understand why people do what they do. And very often they're very kind of simple things that you would expect an education system will deliver immediately. From the point of view of professionals in education, this is basic things like job security and adequate pay. And very often, if you say, well, now you have a code of conduct, if we don't provide a degree of protection for people in the system to actually adhere to this code, they're going to be in the same position like before. They will be susceptible to pressures just because they're afraid for their job, for their career, and so on and so on. So without protecting teachers, just giving them a code of conduct in a context that is riddled with integrity vulnerabilities is definitely not going to help, because they depend on their principal, they depend on, and so on and so on. From the point of view of parents and students, very often codes of conduct don't go there, but we also have basic things like access to education and a chance to progress in a fair way, so that your kid has a chance to get to the next school or to a job or to whatever your aspiration is. And there too, if this is not somehow guaranteed, or if we don't see that there's a critical mass of fair decisions and success stories in this way, you can write all codes you want. People will still keep on looking for alternative ways to secure these two very basic deliverables. And so, yeah, and in question from the point of view of central authorities, very often if you read the codes of conduct as a solution, the role of central authorities is not clearly defined. What is their responsibility and all that? We don't really know. And if you ask me what is the motivation of central authorities and regional authorities to engage in what they, in integrity violations, this is the most mysterious part in a way, because we're kind of quick to conclude that they do this just because of financial reasons and they want to steal the money. Very often it goes deeper than that. And I feel that in the research we have done so far, if there is one area where one could do more to understand what their contribution is, in addition to defining the rules, all right, this will be an area that really would require additional work, because this is a mysterious area. And having this kind of a third element of the puzzle, I think, would be important in case we want to stick to the same positive approach, saying people what the good things they could do, but also providing them with support to do that. And this is how we also define integrity. It's not only about what we do, it's also about creating and sustaining the right conditions that enable people to act in accordance with whatever we think is a good way of doing things.
Thank you, Michal, and thank you, Ole, for this really multi-perspectivity in your answers. It really seems that we have a lot of stories that need still to be told, and a lot of research areas that actually are now emerging as relevant as we are already thinking in our follow-up activities. Thank you both for being with us today at the beginning of your holiday, I guess, I hope for you. And I also encourage our audience to have a look in our national reports and synthesis report in the publication section of our website, EduPolicy.net. And see you at the next episode of Edu Focus. Olja and Mihailo, thank you very much for being with us today. Bye.
You too. Take care.